So right, today we're going to be, or I'm going to be, making a hardwood copy of this bowl. This is a bowl that I just prototyped using a bit of pine, a little bit of hardwood here and there, just messing about really. It was the result of many test cuts on the bandsaw to get the stave segments, both the angles right, because obviously on the stave segments it's not only a straightforward 11.25 degrees anymore, but we've also got an angle that goes from the top to the bottom of the stave as well. So to cut that, I usually, because I really haven't got a decent way of measuring the angles, I have to sort of just use my square, which is set up in minutes, degrees and minutes. That's reasonably accurate but not fantastic. So I set this up, and I make my angles roughly on the bandsaw. What I do then, to get to this stage where I've got 16 segments that are glued together nicely without any gaps, is I make test half rings. I make, so that when you glue them up you can tell whether they're going to be right or not, because if you put them on a flat surface, if they sit nice and square on the flat surface, which this one doesn't, because this was a ring that wasn't right, the angle wasn't right on this. I still needed to close the angle up on the bandsaw so that it would lay flat. So obviously closing the angle up would take a bit off this edge of the segment, allowing the ring to sit flatter. Don't know whether the other one I got here was the right one or not. Well, it's probably the one after that one, where I still just got a tiny fraction to put to take off the angle on my sledge so that it lays flat. It's not too bad. So anyway, that's how I go about it. I make a lot of these test half rings, gradually getting the angle on the sled right for the angle that I've set on the table of the bandsaw. So I'm going to run through that in a sec on the bandsaw. Right, so for this project I've got this mahogany, 3-dimension from some old window frames. Obviously when I lived in Wales they had new windows put in next door, and I managed to acquire this nice mahogany from around the windows. So that's going to make up our stave segments for the compound angle stave segments for the outer ring, for the main ring of the bowl. Obviously the depth of the bowl is going to be roughly the same as this one. You can see the segments there. By the time they're sanded top and bottom to get them flat, they'll be just slightly taller than the edge of this bowl. Right, so once again at the bandsaw now, I've got this sled that I made, which has got the correct angle fixed. You can see there's various screw holes here where I've been messing about closing the angle up or opening up a little bit just to get the segments so that a half ring of segments will sit exactly flat on the surface when they're all glued together. I'll show you how I glue them all together later. So originally I started off with just this bit of plywood. I made this to fit in the running slot on the saw. Good fit. not loose at all. If it's loose, it'll let the board slop around from side to side. So I just put a screw through into this bit of pine initially, just to hold this end, so that I could still move this end backwards and forwards a bit, backwards and forwards a bit, for setting up the angle, the edge angle of the segment. And when I got it right, I drove that screw in there so that I know that's going to be right now for the angle that I have set on my table, which is the angle that's set on this. I haven't moved it since. It's so I've set the table angle up to the angle that's set on this. I really could do with a decent digital protractor of some kind to set the angles with, but no money, so I have to make do with what I've got, or what I can afford anyway. Right, so having set up that angle, I then want to make a pot that's so roughly the same top diameter as this. So I got this segment here that I know from a previous bowl will make a bowl with an outer top diameter of about the same as this, really. So what I do then, I'm just going to make it slightly smaller than this segment. What I do then is I just adjust my stop block that I got here so that this segment is just over the line, because I'm going to make it just a bit smaller, so it's just over the line. Oh. And I'll take my clamp and I'll just clamp that into position on the sled. So that it can't move. There we go. So now every time I put the block of wood in there that I'm going to cut, it's going to cut a segment, well, just shorter than this one that I've used to set the saw up. What I usually do, I usually cut a spare segment when I'm making my rings, so that if I want to make another ring that size, I can just set it up to the segment that I've got spare. I know what bowl it's come from, I know how big the bowl is going to be, so that's what we do. Right, let's put the dust extractor on the saw, on my shop sniff. Bits of wood that I cut earlier. Let's put the dust extractor on, and then what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut these segments with this piece of wood upright, and then once I cut the one edge, I'll turn it over and cut the angle opposite, so that I still get in the opposite angle on the segments, so this should all go together nicely. So I just cut the first one with a little bit of waste off the end. There we go. You can see that's a compound angle there now. Let's just put it up to the stop block. In the other direction. So there you go, first one. As you can see from that, compound angle, and it slopes from top to the bottom. So that when it's together, it will be sort of roughly that angle. All the sections will joined together at a roughly that angle, give us a sloped side, compound angle. So we'll cut all those. See you soon. Right, so that's all 16 seconds on this car. That's forward there. What I do now is I'll set up to just sand the brake out off and be ready for gluing up then. Right, so what I'm going to do now is going to just glue these segments up. The glue I'm using, they're not my usual glue. It's this Evo stick, just a normal resin based glue. Because the way you have to glue these segments up is slightly different. Because of the compound angle, there's not really any good way to clamp them up. So I saw in a small video on YouTube a pretty good video that used a rub joint, and I thought, well, he was just using it on normal flat rings, but I thought, well, rub joint, maybe I can use that on my compound angles. So what you do, you just make sure there's a bit of glue on both sides of the thing, just rub them together, and you can feel it get tight. As you rub them together, you can feel it get tight. And once it's tight, make sure they're lined up nicely. And leave them to dry. 2 together at first, so you'll end up with 8 lots of 2. I probably put just slightly too much glue on that one. I'll put a bit less on this one. Doesn't soak up quite so well as the pine. But just make sure they're both covered. Just rub them together, and you'll feel it tighten up to the stage where you can still slide them about a little bit. Make sure they're all lined up nicely. No clamps required. I made this ring exactly the same way. Wasn't clamped, but just rubbed, the joints were just rubbed together and glued up. So glue, rub the joint together. Where's the camera? Just rub the joint together, make sure the glue on both sides of the block, and it will tighten up. Once it tightens up, just make sure it's lined up nicely. So, glue on the block. Let's say just a normal resin based glue. This Evo stick, waterproof, or weatherproof, not waterproof, weatherproof glue. And just rub them together till it tightens up. You can feel it tighten up as you're rubbing them together. Used to have an awful job trying to clamp these things together, but I don't anymore. Obviously, if I was using my foaming glue, I couldn't do this because the glue foaming pushes the blocks apart, so I can't use my foaming glue for this. But I say, I made that other pine ring exactly the same, and it held together on the lathe, didn't fly apart. Maybe the joints aren't quite as tight as they could have been, but for no clamps, it's not bad. Right, so gluing these up. Camera's not in a very good place. Can't get it the other side of the freezer, unfortunately. Obviously, if you're working on top of your freezer, Put a board on top of it, eh? So just rub them together. You can feel it tighten up. To the stage where you can just push them into line. Put them down nice and gently to dry. I mean, this glue, it says you can handle after 5 minutes, but on this hardwood I think I would leave it a little bit longer than that, because it doesn't soak in as much as it did on the pine. So there we go, last one. Oops. So I'll leave those for a good 10-15 minutes now before I try and glue them any further. Right, so what we're going to be doing now, I'm going to be just gluing these bits together that I've already glued together into groups of 2 using a rubbed glue joint. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to just rub them together again, so there's a group of 4 segments now, which would be a quarter of the bowl, quarter of the sides of the bowl. So just a bit of glue, make sure they're the right way around, just rub them together, make sure you've got glue on both sides, and just keep rubbing them, press them slightly together, rub them, and you can feel the glue start to tighten up. And when it tightens up, just make sure you just press them into shape so they're lined up nicely and put them down to dry. So just do this, another one, rub them together, make sure the glue on both sides, keep rubbing and pressing slightly, and then you just feel them stuck together. Make sure they're lined up, because if they're not lined up at this stage, then good chance they won't be lined up when you're finished. Alright. So just you can feel it tighten up. I used to have real fun trying to glue these up, messing about with rubber bands and all sorts of rubbish, trying to get them to, trying to be able to clamp them. Alright, so that's that for another 10 minutes or so, 10-15 minutes, because this hardwood doesn't soak the glue up as well as the pine did, so should be good. Come back to you then. Right, so it's been a little while now since I glued these together. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to glue them together again, so that there's 2 halves of a ring. Okay, do it exactly the same way. Make sure there's no rubbish on the join there. Just rub them together, make sure both sides are well coated. Rub them, rub them, rub them. You can feel it get tight. Not bad. A little bit of sanding on the edge and it'll be perfect. Just a little tiny bit, that's all. Alright, rub them together. Oh, miles too Right, rub them together, make sure there's enough glue on both sides. Make sure they're nicely lined up. Oops. Push down on it and broke them. Alright. If you get one that comes apart, just rub it together a bit more again. As long as there's enough glue there, it'll suck back together again. Okay, that's both the halves of both halves done now. And looking at it down here, I can see it's pretty flat. It's going to be pretty flat. Alright, I'll come back to you when I'm ready to glue both halves together. Right, I've gone back to my sled that I use with the blade at 90 degrees. 11¼ degrees on the sled, 90 degrees on the blade to the table. This is just going to be a normal flat ring, 16 segment ring that I'll just put around the top edge of the bowl for the contrast, i.e. as you can see on this one, I put this piece of mahogany around the top of this pine bowl, and the contrast is quite good, but obviously on the other bowl the side's dark, so the top's going to be light. Okay, I'm just going to cut those 16 segments on my bandsaw. Okay, that's just going to be for the top ring. I love the smell of ash when it's cut. Right, so what I've done, for the base this is, I've actually glued a couple of bits of mahogany with a bit of beech in the middle. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to cut it on a bandsaw, turning it over so I get the angle opposite all the time. But first I've got to set up to make sure the stop's in the right place. So we don't want to waste any of the width of this timber. We want the blade to start cutting exactly so we leave a sharp point on the end and not any flat, and we don't leave a zigzag appearance on the edge of the board. It's just slightly too far still. Slightly too far. Alright, that'll do it. So what I do now, I'll move my stop so that it's up to it. Oops. Let's drop that on the floor, eh? I'll have to get myself one of those that just clamps shut, I think. Right, so now when I put that back in there, no damage done. It's exactly the right place. So when I start cutting now on the corner here, right, it's going to leave a sharp point without narrowing the width of the segment. So it's just on the point where it's just going to leave a sharp point. So I cut those. So as you can see, there's a nice sharp point on the end of the segment. I'll cut those now. Right, so I've been sanding up, and remember that this is the bit that I glued together to cut the segments for the base from. So when you cut the segments, obviously you're turning the board over all the time, so you end up with the effect that you get a longer and a shorter section in the middle. No, wrong side, there you go. A longer and a shorter section in the middle. As you can see, they line up pretty well now. I've got my saw set up so that it's almost exactly 11¼ degrees now, so when I cut these long segments, as long as I get the blade on the right on the edge, the far edge of the plank as I'm cutting it, I get a nice sharp point and they meet up lovely in the middle. As you see, it's a reasonably good effect, easy to do. I say you just glue 3 strips of wood together and that's the effect you get. Okay. Also sanded down the top ring that I've made. I made the top ring, and I cut the segments for that. That's sanded down now. Just waiting to be all put together. I'm just waiting for the glue to dry on those other 2 halves of the ring properly before I sand them down and glue them together. Right, onwards. Right, now I'm just going to show you an example of what happens when you get a bit cocky. What happened with this bowl, when I cut the segments, what I normally do when I do this, even when I have to reset the table, I normally always make a test half circle again, but I didn't in this case. And what happened is that the table angle wasn't right, so when I sanded it so that they would go together, like that, it wasn't a circle because the upright angle, table angle hadn't been right. The top width of the segment wasn't wide enough to make a full circle in 16 segments. So what I've done to rescue the situation is that I drew a circle with the same diameter as the bottom of the bowl was going to be, and then I put these 2 halves onto that circle so that I could see how much I needed to fill in. What I did then, I made 2 just ordinary square segments of wood. They're not staves or anything, they're just 2 sections of wood so that I can extend the circle, so that on one either side, opposite each other. And then what I do, I'll just give that a tiny bit of sand in now, and it'll be a circle again, well, as near as, and I'll still be able to use it. I won't have wasted all that wood. So I say, just show you a way to rescue a situation if you have to. It's going to look a little bit peculiar because the segments won't line up quite right with the base anymore, but as long as they're still all overlapping mostly, it'll be okay. The same with the top ring. Right, onwards we go. As you can see, I've glued the two halves together now. I've got obviously these two shorter pieces of wood in there now because, as I explained earlier, when I cut it, it was wrong. We'll get back to that as soon as I can.